Hey there, Alex here from Nintu, and in this video we're going to talk a little bit about Tailwind, what it is, why we use it as our framework of choice, and potentially why you should think about using it for your WordPress and Bricks Builder projects. So, before we get into all the little details, I just want to frame the conversation to get us all on the same page and thinking in the same way. So, a few quick questions before we get started. First is, are you an agency, a freelancer, or part of a marketing team that's going to be working across multiple projects or multiple funnels or even multiple pages? The second is, on each of those projects, how many times are you going to have to go back and add new components or edit components and really continue to grow either that website, that project, or that customer? And then third is, how many different people will be working on this project? So is it just you? Is it your own website? You're just building it once and you're good to go? Or is it you and then you're handing it off to a client? Or are you part of a marketing team and there's multiple marketers working on a landing page? So if the answer to any of those questions is more than one, you're more than one person, part of an agency, or you're a freelancer working with more than one project, or you're part of a marketing team where there's multiple of you, or handing them off maybe to a client, you might have already started noticing some of the limitations with using CSS on its own or with using the default page builder settings to style your different components on your website. So, if we wanted to create websites that have virtually unlimited scalability, that remain consistent in design through project to project, and really streamline the way we build them and make our life a little bit easier as web developers and web designers, there's three main things that we need to fix or take care of and resolve with CSS. First one is naming. That is pretty much in the title. It is how we name our different CSS classes or how we let our page builders handle the naming for us. So if we were to jump into the builder here, and let's say I imported a section and I'm going to add a title to this section, a little heading, and a little description. Now, let's say I wanted some space on top of that. I could go into my container here, go into my styling, layout, and add some margin or some padding at the top. For the most part, this works pretty well. Downside to this though is, what if on a different page I wanted to create a different layout? Well, I'll go back into my second page. Let's, for the example here, add a new section. And on my second page, I'd go in and set my top padding to, let's say I wanted nothing on this page. It works. What's actually happening in the background though is it's creating a new line of CSS for every single different style we create. So you can see you'd have your section here that has its ID, and then tied to that ID would be the styling behind it. Then you'd have a different container here with its own ID, and that ID has its own styling behind it again. Now, if you're just building a simple website with a couple of pages, doing things this way really won't have a big impact on your speed. But if you were to do this across a large site with potentially hundreds of pages, imagine the amount of lines of CSS that are going to be added to your style sheet for all the different variables of spacing and sizes and colors and backgrounds and all the different style elements that go in to your style sheet. It essentially creates a new line for every single style that you add. Now, you might have already thought about this, so you've started using class names. And so instead of editing just the default padding here, you've set up a class, and this class, let's call it section padding top none. Now for this class, you've given it no padding at the top. And then you reuse this class every time you want something with no padding at the top. Now, this works, and it does save a fair amount of resources, but think about all of the different variables you would have to add for all of those different types of classes, not to mention what kind of consistency you're going to keep within the naming. So you might have here, you have section padding top none, then you've got section padding top some, section padding top a lot. and then you create a new page and you bring in those classes, but you want to change something. And if you change that class name, it affects the other pages. It very, very quickly becomes messy. So this is the first thing we really need to look at and look at solving. How are we going to name our CSS so it's both consistent across not just this website, but all the websites that we build, in case we need to go back to it in the future, we need to go figure out what we want to change. And the second is, how do we really reduce all of that extra CSS that might be added, that extra weight to our code, which gradually makes our websites load slower and slower as we build more and more pages into them. Now, second problem we often come across with just letting the page builder decide or creating our own CSS classes is consistency. And that is, how do we ensure that we maintain consistent colors, spacing, styles, anything that can be applied via CSS across all of the different pages on our different projects? Now, you might jump into your project and you're like, all right, for this project, I'm always going to be adding 20 pixels of margin in between each of my sections. What happens if you then hand off the project to someone else, or someone else needs to come in and edit? Or more often than not, future you comes back to the project and starts editing again. How do you ensure that things remain consistent between the different versions and the different updates? So you might have thought to yourself, well, I'm going to go back to using the class name method, which again solves the problem, but only somewhat. So let's say you go and you set your padding top none, and then that class has a consistent no padding at the top, and you always use that same class throughout this project. What I find happens is if I ever hand the project off to someone, they don't necessarily know all the class names that I've set up, so they start adding their own one. And then again, our style sheet starts growing, and we have inconsistencies on our different websites and different web pages. Or again, back to future me, or past me, I come back to a project. I have since learnt a lot more than I knew before about web development and CSS, and I've got a new set of rules and structures that I like for my websites, and I go back to an old project that has the old stuff before I learnt all the cool new shit, and I'm like, do I now follow the old methodology? Do I upgrade the entire website to my newly learnt methodology? Do I go somewhere in between and use a bit of both? But then again, it becomes messy, and really, it's not what we want. That's what we're trying to solve, right? The third problem with using just the page builder on its own or creating your own CSS is scalability. Now, we've touched on this a little bit with the previous 2 points, but have you ever wondered why your website starts to slow down? Like, you install your new WordPress instance, you set up your base plugins, you install your Bricks theme, you build your first few pages, everything runs super smooth, it's snappy, you share it to your friend, it loads quickly for them, there's no problems at all. And then as you're building out all the other pages and the website starts to grow and scale, things aren't quite as quick anymore. Things don't load as fast. They don't snap into place. That client is coming back and being like, why is this page taking long to load? A lot of this is caused from our CSS. Now, it's a little bit different if you're a beginner and you're just using the default theme or builder settings, or if you're a little bit more advanced and you've set up your own class names and a bit of your own utility framework. So let's start with the beginner one. You use Bricks as it is in its default state. You go in, you edit all your different styles. Every single style that you edit, every heading, every container, every section, every text, every single one that you add a new style to adds a new line of code. And as you're building out an entire website that might have 10 plus pages, that quickly becomes an issue. Or you've switched to a bit of a more utility framework or CSS framework, and so you're adding different class names. But to cover all of the different variables would create a huge style sheet between all the different spacings, text size, colors, etc. Not to mention, you're then going in and styling things a little bit different for mobile or for tablet and making it all nice and responsive. It can quickly add up, and it is both hard to manage, but also hard to optimize in the long term. All right, Alex, enough with the problems. Let's get to some of the solutions. Let's dive into some of the solutions that exist out there that are outside of Tailwind. First solution we're going to look at is SAS. Now, SAS is a very widely used framework in the web development industry. It's very well known, it's very well adopted, it's very well documented, and it solves some of our problems. We get our consistency done with SAS, and that works quite well. But it doesn't solve our naming problems, because you can pretty much set anything as a name, and every developer has their own way of keeping their naming clean and consistent. And it doesn't quite solve our scalability issue either, especially if you're working on a really, really large site, or if you're like us, where you have different kinds of styles across different kinds of templates. It would really add a lot to our style sheet. The second solution out there is Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap is also very well adopted, very well known, and it covers more of the problems, or has a solution to more of the problems than what we originally had with SAS. Now, Bootstrap would fix the naming conventions mostly, because it has its own naming convention. You follow that, everything is good. Every new developer that comes on board knows the naming convention, and future me that is still working with Bootstrap would come back, no issues there. It covers our consistency, because you can set everything up front between your different sizes and spacing and styles. But it doesn't quite cover our scalability, especially for us looking to offer multiple types of components with different designs. We'd have to be creating those on our own as like new components, and then we kind of have the same problem all over again. What happens with the naming? What happens with that consistency? So anything that would fall outside of Bootstrap without really expanding on it isn't quite covered. The third solution we looked at and explored were other WordPress frameworks. Frameworks like ACSS or Oxymade. We looked at a few others, and they kind of get there, but not quite. We run into two issues typically with the framework. Either option A, they don't cover everything that we need covered, and then we're back to ground one with creating our own names and our own styles and making sure that that's consistent. That doesn't quite work if we want to scale the business. Option number two, it's a framework that's much more expansive. It does cover a lot more of these, but then the framework is continuously growing and growing and growing and getting heavier with every update that they push out. And even with the option to be able to disable certain utilities or disable certain styles to limit the size of the framework, we'd really be limiting ourselves to what we could create. And we don't want to do that, right? We want to be able to build whatever we want to be able to build and not have load times impacted. In short, with most of the solutions out there, you have to compromise in one way or another. Until we came across Tailwind. And for once, you get to eat your cake and keep it too. So let's dive into Tailwind and have a look at how Tailwind as a framework solves all of the core problems that we had when exploring a CSS system. Tailwind really solves all of the problems that we highlighted earlier. It might not be the only tool that can solve all of these problems, but it's the only one that we found that does it all out of the box without any extra effort on our part. Starting from the naming and the naming conventions, it's really, really simple. Every single class follows the same naming structure, and we've got some examples here. If I was to go and look at padding, for example, you can see P-1, P-2, P-3, PT, so padding top -1, padding top -2, -3, super consistent, and this is applied throughout their framework. Moving on to consistency. With Tailwind, everything is interconnected and intertwined in its own big system or big engine, and it keeps things really, really consistent. So if you were to say, change the scale, you wanted to change the amount of padding, let's say, that was added to the P-2 class, you can change the type scale, and this would apply not just to paddings, but also margins, spacings, anything else that would use that sizing scale. So if you were to make any changes, or you were to say make it fluid so that it would grow and shrink based on viewport size, you would do this in one place, and then all of your different class names would follow through, and they would use the same sizing and keep the same naming convention. Then moving on to scalability. Now, there's quite a few little points into this, but this was the number one reason we ended up going with Tailwind and using Winden for the integration. First part is it's mature. Tailwind is not yet super popular in the WordPress space, especially in the builder space that we live in, but it is the go-to tool for any web app development or mobile app development, at least as of the recent years. For building websites, it has just about every case or use case that's already been explored, fixed, patched, or set up for scale. And that's really because it's matured and it's had other communities to help grow it before we jumped on board. Tailwind is also fast, like crazy fast. And the way they've implemented this is really cool. It's not like any of the other frameworks out there that load up the entire framework. They've built their own little system that they call just-in-time mode, or the just-in-time engine. Now, essentially what this JIT, or just-in-time engine, does is it scans your website for all of the utility classes that are out there and that are being used, and then gets rid of all the rest of the framework, so that only the stuff that's being used on the page that's being loaded is loaded up to the user. What this means is they can continue to expand their framework as much as they want. We can continue to build on it as much as we want, and we can really use every single part of it without having to ever worry about, oh, will it impact my page load time? Is this really going to add a lot of bloat to my CSS file? Everything stays really, really fast, no matter how much you want to grow and scale the system. Next point in scalability is that everything is connected. Let's say you wanted to add your own brand colors. You could go out and look for a brand color generator for Tailwind. Let's look for one here. So this is my go-to color generator for Tailwind. I can plug in my brand color. Let's say I want a fancy Nintu red, and maybe I want to also add my neutral colors. I can plug that in. Just go for a gray. It gives me the code that I chuck in the settings, and then everything gets updated and is interconnected, from my font colors, my background colors, my borders, my shadows. Everything that would use my color system is automatically updated and set within this framework. And the same goes, as we said earlier, for the scale. If we wanted to change the spacing of things, that's all interconnected. Anything really that we would want to update and edit, we can do so without doing it outside of the framework, so that at the end of the day, we have things like the default bricks builder settings that all use our default Tailwind settings. The last two reasons is the expandability and the future of Tailwind. On the expandability side, they make it really, really easy to add additional features and functions within the framework in a very similar fashion to the way WordPress allows you to bring in different plugins. They actually call them both the same thing. So you could look up some of their plugin settings here, or even do a quick Google search of Tailwind plugins and find hundreds of different free plugins on the market that you can quickly import and connect to your project. And again, it still lives within that same interconnected system. You're never typically adding extra bloat, but I would say the same way of thinking about WordPress plugins and Tailwind plugins needs to be applied here, where just use the good quality ones, because if you're loading your site up with hundreds of plugins, things are going to go wrong. And finally, Tailwind is here to stay. The fact that the framework is not tied to any specific platform, it's not just a WordPress framework, it's something that's used across the entire web development scene and even app development scene, means that there is no WordPress update, no Oxygen breakdancing or bricks that becomes end of life at some point is going to impact the way Tailwind continues to grow and scale. Tailwind will be around regardless of what happens to anything in the WordPress space, and that's something that really gives me a lot of confidence in the product. To add to that, anything you learn within the framework here can also be applied and taken across to other platforms. If you were to learn how to build an entire front end with Bricks Builder and Tailwind, you could take those same skills and apply them to building a front end on a mobile app or a web app or anything else that you could use Tailwind with. It's a skill that will stay with you beyond your WordPress journey and into the future of web development. With all that said, how do you actually get started in using Tailwind with WordPress or Bricks Builder or any of your other WordPress projects? Well, there's a couple of great tools to kick it off. The first is Winden. Winden is a plugin built by dplugins, and it essentially does all the heavy lifting of the setup for you. More or less, you just install the plugin, activate it, maybe define your brand colors, and then you're pretty good to go. The second little resource I'd keep handy is the cheat sheet by NerdCave. Tailwind does have a lot of classes. I'm not exactly sure how many, but there's a lot. And when you're getting started, it's hard to memorize all of the different ones. So this cheat sheet is a great place to start when you're looking for your different spacing, paddings, margins. You can just search up here. If I wanted to say define a maximum width, I could just search for max dash, and you can see I've got max width here, and it gives me all of my different classes. From there, I can just copy that name, jump back over to my Bricks Builder, and paste it in the class name, and it will be applied. Last but not least is a couple of free resources we have from Nintu. So if you just jump over to the Nintu website or in the article that's linked down below, in the footer here you'll see typography, layouts, buttons, and dark mode. And all you need to do to start using these is jump over the page, select the variant you want. Do you want it as a heading or as a text? You can copy that or click on the button, jump back over to your own page, and then just paste it in the section that you want. And you'll see it will pull it in with all the right classes and comes pre-configured for light and dark mode. The same goes for your different paragraph elements, maybe your dark mode buttons. We've got a bunch of pre-created buttons here that will pick up your brand colors as well as your neutral colors, and some great little layouts to get you started if you wanted a 2-column grid, a 3-column grid, and so on. They're all already set up for dark mode and are fully responsive. Lastly, if you are looking for some extra templates and maybe you want to get a head start on your website building with Tailwind, we do offer all these as well at Nintu. They are all a part of our premium subscription, but you could go in and say you wanted to grab a hero and you were building out a page. You could simply click on it here, find the one you like. I like this one. Then simply click on the copy for Winden and Bricks button. Then you can jump back over to whatever page you're editing. Clear this out, paste it in. You can see it pulls everything in. You just need to reconnect the image that you want as a background. That is pretty much all I've got for you today. It was quite a long video, but thank you very much for sticking around. Please don't hesitate to either comment down below, send me a message, ping me or tag me on Facebook. I'm in all of the same groups as you are. Always here to answer and to give back to much of the community that helps me get started and help me learn and grow to who I am today. But otherwise, squad, yeah, thanks again for being part of the video. Like, subscribe if you feel like it, or if this brought you any value. Stay tuned for some of the next episodes or next videos where I'll be diving a little bit deeper into Tailwind and WordPress and Bricks itself and showing you how you can create your own components and your own templates there. And if there's nothing else, have a lovely day and I'll see you in the next one.